A mass of rotting flesh staggers towards you. Its form seems human, but it has been horribly disfigured. It's missing appendages. Its flesh hangs off its bones in ragged strips, and its eyes are like two black holes bored into its skull. As the creature hobbles closer and closer, it reaches out its only remaining arm, its gnarly hand grasping for the supple skin of your face. As its hand gets closer, the putrid stench of sun-baked, decaying flesh hits you like a hammer, causing you to cough. You turn to run, but realize that you are trapped by a fence. You desperately begin to scramble over it, but just as you hoist yourself to the top, another zombie grabs your leg and drags you towards its waiting mouth with a steely grip. You scream and your bowl of popcorn falls to the floor as you quickly reach to turn on the light. What is the point of watching a movie like this, you wonder, as you pause the television? How can such a creature serve any other purpose than to give me nightmares? Monsters such as zombies have been a popular way to express fear throughout human history. Ancient Greek monsters often represented xenophobic fears of different cultures. When Alexander the Great sent word of his conquest back to Greece, he described uncivilized people groups as inhuman monsters. The Anglo-Saxons also used monsters to express their fears of the uncivilized world. However, unlike the Greeks who crossed into unknown lands with the intention to destroy and subdue, the Anglo-Saxons feared monsters who crossed the boundary into civilization unprovoked, like Grendel from Beowulf. These monsters were given the name Mirkstapan, which means boundary walker. There are also many examples of monsters that appear in the Bible, such as Daniel's 4 beasts, the Leviathan, and dragons. Today, many of the most popular movies and television shows feature monsters, such as the movie It, a film about a monstrous, shape-shifting clown which became the highest-grossing horror movie of all time. Monsters have also been popular characters in book series, such as the Harry Potter series, featuring werewolves, giants, basilisks, dementors, and man-eating spiders, and the Twilight Saga, featuring vampires and werewolves. Zombies have been growing in popularity throughout recent American history and have reached a worldwide peak over the last decade. The popular post-apocalyptic show, The Walking Dead, reached its peak in 2014 when the premiere episode of the 5th season gained a staggering 17.3 million viewers, and the zombie movie World War Z grossed $540 million at the box office. The term monster is a word that can be used to refer to many different and separate things. A monster is a creature that simultaneously inspires fear and intrigue, lure and repulsion. It can be used to refer to beings who, through their evil actions, have abdicated their humanity. A monster can be a strange, otherworldly creature, or it can appear almost human in form. Culture can be described as the sum of traditions, values, fears, difficulties, and artistic expressions of a society at a certain point in time. Monsters offer a unique insight into the collective fears of the cultures that create and popularize them. First, Dr. Frankenstein's monster represents the fear of advances in science and technology, both around the time it was written and in the modern world. Secondly, vampires represent the anxieties of Victorian England. Finally, zombies, as a more recently emerging monster, represent fears of past and current America, such as the fear of voodoo culture, uncontrollable disease, and the possibility of an apocalypse. When Mary Shelley released Frankenstein in 1818, Victor Frankenstein's monster was a response to the discovery of electricity and the fears that people had concerning it. In the early 19th century, electricity was the most popular and debated issue. Since it was still a relatively mysterious topic, it generated anxiety and fear from the common people. These fears were amplified by the experiments done by well-known scientists, such as Galvani's animation of a frog leg and Erasmus Darwin's supposed electrocution of a noodle. In these experiments, it seemed that electric charge could bring to life inanimate or dead objects. These experiments sparked the notion that humans are only machines animated by electricity, which came to be known as galvanism. This fear was also seen in the philosophy of materialism, the belief that nothing exists but the physical, which is gaining popularity at the time. People were afraid that there was nothing more to a person than electricity and flesh. Frankenstein shows this fascination with electricity and galvanic principles from Victor Frankenstein's early life through his creation of the monster. As a child, Victor is fascinated by electricity. Shelley writes, "As I stood at the door, on a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak. The catastrophe of this tree excited my extreme astonishment, and I eagerly inquired of my father the nature and origin of thunder and lightning. He replied, electricity." Shelley portrays electricity as a powerful and destructive force. Victor's discovery of electricity has the same destructive and all-consuming effect on his young mind and imagination. Also in the story, a scientist comes to young Victor's home and talks about galvanism. These new discoveries and beliefs greatly influenced Victor's young mind, and it was this influence that would inspire him to create his monster. The monster that Dr. Frankenstein creates mirrors the belief in Galvanism and materialism at the time it was written, as it is a being made out of dead or inanimate parts that have been brought to life by scientific means. When describing the horror and fear that this monster inspires, Shelley writes, "I had worked for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body, but now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart." In Victor's haze of ambition and scientific curiosity, he was not able to see the horror of the being that he created. Throughout the rest of the story, this creature wreaks havoc on Victor's life, killing many of his close family members. In portraying Dr. Frankenstein's monster as dangerous, Mary Shelley urges caution and says that this new scientific discovery and emerging philosophy have the potential for getting out of control. Frankenstein's continued popularity shows modern science's concern with morality and the ethics behind new scientific advances. As society and culture have progressed, Frankenstein has now come to be interpreted as a cautionary tale of the advances in modern science separate from morality. Shelley subtitled her novel, The Modern Prometheus. In Greek mythology, Prometheus created humans and helped them become the dominant creature on Earth. However, he is punished greatly for doing this. Frankenstein mirrors this in the way that Dr. Frankenstein creates an anthropomorphic being that causes him to lose everything he has. This is how Frankenstein is interpreted today. It has been applied to everything from the cloning of sheep to artificial intelligence to in vitro fertilization to gene editing to atomic bombs. This fascination with Shelley's novel demonstrates that many people view these advancements as man-made monsters that, like Dr. Frankenstein's monster, have the potential to become uncontrollable and wreak havoc on humanity. As the Victorian era drew to a close, Bram Stoker released Dracula in 1897, bringing vampires into popularity in Victorian society. Dracula offers a unique insight into the fin de siècle fears and anxieties of the Victorian England. During the time that Dracula was published, Victorian England was concerned with sexual promiscuity and the moral decay that it caused. Greg Buswell, the curator of contemporary literary archives at the British Library, says that the act of vampirism itself, with its notion of tainted blood, suggests the fear of sexually transmitted disease. In Dracula, Stoker uses the transfusion of blood between people or between a vampire and a person to suggest some kind of sexual relationship. For this reason, the act of a vampire sucking blood from their victim can be seen as a kind of corruption. Unlike most other monsters, vampires such as Dracula are not large and menacing or hideously disfigured. Rather, they are portrayed as mysterious, alluring creatures of the night. Stoker uses this to show that although these sins seem desirable, there is ultimately evil behind them. When describing a female vampire, Stoker writes, "There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive. As she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and the red tongue as it lapped the white, sharp teeth." In describing the beautiful vampire women that live in Dracula's castle, Stoker emphasizes the sexual undertones of vampirism, while also contrasting these women that Dracula has corrupted to the two pure women, Lucy and Mina, that Dracula preys upon later in the book. Buswell goes on to add, Stoker is deliberately aligning Count Dracula with everything respectable late Victorian society would have considered morally corrupting, criminal, and perverse. Because of this, Dracula offers a unique insight into the Victorian fear of sexual impurity and moral corruption. Dracula also demonstrates the Victorian anxiety about the relationship between the modern and medieval world. The Victorian age was and is seen as a period of transition between the old world and the new by historians as well as people alive at the time. Stoker fills Dracula with references to the modern technologies of the Victorian era, such as blood transfusions, in order to show that it is set in the New World. However, when facing Dracula, the main characters are forced to turn to superstitions, such as garlic and wooden stakes, when modern science fails them. In the story, when planning their attack on Dracula, Dr. Van Helsing says, "All we have to go upon are superstitions and legends. These do not at first appear much when the matter is one of life and death, yet we must be satisfied." And then goes on to add, "A year ago, which of us would have received such a possibility in the midst of our skeptical, matter-of-fact 19th century? Dracula pulls the main characters out of the rational modern world and plunges them into medieval superstition and Old English folklore. Walter Houghton writes in his book, The Victorian Frame of Mind, that to the Victorians, the past which they had outgrown was not the Romantic period, and not even the 18th century. It was the Middle Ages. From their perspective, it was the medieval tradition from which they had irrevocably broken. This is why Dracula would have been such a terrifying monster to the Victorian people. Living in his medieval castle with his ability to scale walls, hypnotize people, transform into bats and wolves, and slip through keyholes, Dracula became an embodiment of the past that modern science alone was not able to defeat. Recently, zombies have become the most popular monster in America. Zombies have their origin in Haitian voodoo beliefs. The Haitian word zombie was used to describe people that had been suspended between life and death by Bokor or witch doctors. In the 1920s, an American man named William Seabrook traveled to Haiti to study voodoo culture, and while he was there, he was introduced to the idea of zombies. When his travel journals were published, Americans took the zombie to represent their racist beliefs that Haitians were a savage and inferior people. These fears of Haitians in voodoo culture are seen portrayed in the first zombie film, White Zombie, in 1932, in which the white protagonists are harassed by evil Haitian voodoo practitioners, but ultimately escape unscathed. In this way, zombies offer a view into the 1930s fear of dark magic and strange cultures. Zombies also demonstrate society's fear of widespread and uncontrollable disease. In a world where new and uncontrollable disease and global disease break out every few years, zombies have become a popular expression of the fear that most of the world's population could be wiped out by an uncontrollable virus. The history of the world is constantly being changed by pandemic diseases, such as the bubonic plague, and more recently, avian flu in 2009, or Ebola in 2014. Stacey Liu, an author for the American Psychological Association, says that Ebola and diseases like it are often blown out of proportion by modern Americans because they hit all the hot buttons. It can be fatal, it's invisible and hard to protect against. Exposure is involuntary, and it's not clear that authorities are in control of the situation. These diseases are also scary to us partially because of their novelty. This is why in most zombie films and books, such as The Walking Dead or World War Z, zombies are the result of a widespread and incurable disease, and cities are the first to be taken over. In 2011, the CDC released the article, Preparedness 101 Zombie Apocalypse, which teaches people how to prepare for a real emergency, while jokingly relating everything to a zombie apocalypse. This article is just one example of how popular zombies are in expressing the modern world's unease about the possibility of widespread disease. But perhaps the most notable reason for the success of the zombie genre is its portrayal of the apocalyptic anxiety that many people feel. Max Brooks, author of World War Z, said, "We are living in very uncertain times. People have a lot of anxiety about the future. They're constantly being battered with these very scary, very global catastrophes. I think a lot of people need a safe place to explore their apocalyptic worries." No matter the context, almost all zombie shows, movies, or books begin with an apocalypse. For this reason, zombies have come to represent the total breakdown of society and the systems we live in. Through zombies, movies, shows, and books, people are able to live out their fears and fantasies of post-apocalyptic life. America's current fascination with zombies reveals its fear about the breakdown of society and the end of the world. So why is it important to know what fears these monsters represent? Are there any real-world implications of the connection between societal fears and these imaginary creatures? Asa Mittman, the author of the Ashgate Research Companion to Monsters and the Monstrous, says, "The monsters and all these traditions discussed here had palpable, tangible effects on the cultures that spawned them, as well as on neighboring and latter cultures. The monsters that we see in movies and read about in books also have just as much influence on our culture as our culture does on them." David Scull says in his book, The Monster Show, that monsters allowed us to deal with our fears in an indirect way. And for this reason, monster stories can either strengthen that fear, can either calm or strengthen that fear. When we see a concept portrayed as a monster, it can cause us to feel negatively about that concept. Because these monsters can influence us in the way we think about certain concepts, it is important to understand what idea they represent. Some may also say that since monsters often portray evil or terrifying things, they can only be used for evil purposes, and therefore Christians ought to avoid monster stories. It is true that monsters portray evil and terrifying things. However, it is because of this that monsters are useful to catch the audience's attention and make a powerful point, and expose evil for what it truly is. In the Bible, God uses monsters like the Leviathan to emphasize his power, and the dragon of Revelation to emphasize the destructive nature of sin. When Frankenstein shows the consequences of man's hubris, and when Dracula represents the destructive nature of sexual immorality, they are portraying these evils as monsters. Christian author N.D. Wilson says in his book, Notes from a Tilt-A-Whirl, "The world is rated R, and no one is checking IDs. Do not try to make it G by imagining the shadows away. Do not try to hide your children from the world. Train them." That is what these monsters do. They can train us to recognize evil for what it truly is when we encounter it in the real world. Since monsters can represent the fears of the culture that created them, it is clear that they are worthy of further study. Monsters such as Dracula and Frankenstein represent the fears that face past societies, and monsters like zombies help us to shed light on the problems facing us today. These past cultures, as well as the modern world, valued these monsters because of their cathartic effect. Because these monsters allow people to deal with their fears in a controlled way, they gain popularity in their culture. For this reason, these monsters can act as a history book for the fears of these societies, which we can use to learn about them. And so the next time you are scared or disturbed by a creature you encounter in a story, dare to take a closer look, past its ghastly appearance and into its reflection of humanity's anxieties. For often, the most terrifying thing about a fictional monster is the dire reality of the fear that it embodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Are ghosts and spirits monsters?
Well, for most of the monsters that I talked about that I did a case study on for this thesis, I chose to focus on monsters that had been somehow like transformed from being human, and so I don't know if I would categorize those as monsters because there's like the paranormal can either be something that people believe is it could be something that people believe are human spirits, and so I wouldn't consider that to be a monster.
What do you think is redemptive? What do you think is a redemptive movie or book in the horror genre?
Well, as far as the horror genre, I mean, of course, say that the ones that I talked about, such as Dracula and Frankenstein, would have redemptive endings because in both of the stories, the monsters that portray evil concepts are defeated. And so I would say that as long as a story can be considered redemptive as long as what it portrays as evil is defeated in the end.
Can Christians read and watch the books and movies you have discussed and find truth, beauty, and goodness?
Well, I would say that these movies and books, they reflect the world of like how it truly is and sin how it truly is. And so I believe that we can find truth, beauty, and goodness in these things being defeated. But I would also say that movies that the movies that, like I talked about, the White Zombie, that it shows this people group that wasn't, it shows them as a stereotype and it shows that should be defeated. I think we wouldn't find truth, beauty, and goodness in that, but we could use that to learn about what these past societies feared.
Which monster do you find most fearful and why?
I wouldn't say that I have personally felt any of these fears that I've described that the past cultures have felt, but just personally, probably Frankenstein, because of the way that it's a creature that has been created from inanimate human parts is unsettling.
Okay. Monsters allow us to deal indirectly with our fears. So what solutions to those fears have Shelley, Stoker, and modern zombie genre writers offered?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
I can. Monsters allow us to deal indirectly with our fears. So what solutions to those fears have Shelley, Stoker, and modern zombie genre writers offered?
I wouldn't say that all of them have offered solutions to these fears. Most of the time when they're expressed in the stories, it's just showing what fears were present in the society, and it doesn't not necessarily always show a solution to them. It's more of just putting you inside the minds of the people at that time.
Has studying this topic changed the way that you watch movies and television?
Well, it definitely has made me more critical in thinking about what I'm watching, because there's always a lot of times there's a type of agenda that the writer or director is trying to push behind that, and so it's always good to look at what that agenda is and make sure it lines up with biblical teaching.
Which monster is your favorite?
The favorite one that I've talked about in my thesis is Dracula, because it offered a whole different perspective on how I looked at the book, and so I enjoyed that.
Thank you, Nathaniel.